A humble elderly woman is denied a seat on a packed train, ignored by everyone around her. But as glances turn to whispers and questions build, a hidden truth begins to surface. This quiet, unassuming woman holds a powerful secret that could turn the entire journey upside down. The train station buzzed with life as passengers hurried to catch their rides, each one busy with their own journey. Among them stood an elderly black woman, her hands wrapped around the handle of an old, worn leather bag. She wore an elegant dress, simple yet dignified, with a gentle smile that softened the lines of her face. The rain drizzled lightly, and she pulled her shawl closer, waiting patiently in line to board the train. She didn't look at her watch or check her ticket nervously like others did. Instead, she stood quietly, observing her surroundings as if she'd seen it all before. When her turn came, she stepped forward, offering her ticket to the inspector at the train door. He was a young man, barely glancing her way as he took the ticket, his expression indifferent. After a quick scan, he looked at her, raising an eyebrow with a slight smirk. "This section is fully reserved," he said, gesturing behind her. "You'll need to move to the standing area in the back." The woman's smile wavered only slightly as she looked at the inspector, a flicker of disappointment crossing her face. But without a word of protest, she nodded and adjusted her shawl, stepping aside as directed. She made her way toward the standing section, carefully navigating through the crowd. People brushed past her without a second glance, and a few looked at her with faint expressions of pity or dismissal, as if assuming she couldn't afford a proper seat. As she stood by the window, steadying herself with one hand on the rail, her gaze drifted outward, watching the rain as it softly tapped against the glass. A faint smile returned to her face as memories began to surface, flickering like scenes from an old movie. She remembered the early days, years ago, when she was young and hopeful, back when things were hard but dreams were bigger. Her old leather bag resting on her arm held not only her travel necessities but small tokens from those past days, a faded photograph, some official documents, and a folded piece of paper yellowed with time. As the train began to move, a soft hum filled the air, blending with the rhythm of raindrops on the windows. She adjusted her grip on the rail, finding a comfortable stance, and allowed her thoughts to wander back to those early days of struggle. She had faced countless obstacles, and though it was long ago, the memories stayed vivid, like threads woven into the fabric of who she had become. There had been times when she had worked tirelessly, days when exhaustion blurred her vision, and nights when hope felt distant. Yet she had pushed on, driven by something unbreakable within her. A few feet away, two staff members exchanged glances, whispering with quick, amused smiles. One of them, a young woman with a slightly smug air, looked in her direction, giving a small laugh before whispering something to her colleague. They seemed to find it funny, watching her standing alone with her old leather bag. She noticed their looks, though she pretended not to, her calm expression unchanging. She'd faced much worse than dismissive glances, and the quiet strength in her eyes hinted that she knew her own worth far better than they did. Suddenly, a group of passengers entered the train, looking for empty seats, their voices breaking the stillness. One young mother struggled to keep her balance while holding her restless child, who was fussing and tugging at her arm. The elderly woman noticed and instinctively reached out, steadying the mother's arm with a gentle touch. "Let me help you," she said softly, offering a reassuring smile. The mother looked at her gratefully. "Thank you, ma'am," she said, clearly relieved, as she tried to calm her child. The older woman smiled and spoke a few kind words to the little one, who quieted down, gazing up at her with wide eyes. As she held the mother's hand for a moment, a warmth seemed to spread, a simple yet meaningful connection shared. The passengers around them watched, some nodding approvingly, though most quickly turned back to their own conversations. In that moment, the elderly woman's gaze softened further. Her thoughts wandered to her own family and the countless sacrifices she had made for them over the years. She was no stranger to hardship and could empathize with the young mother's struggles. It was a reminder of the many roles she had carried in life: a mother, a caregiver, and now, something even greater. But here, standing in this crowded train, she was simply herself, unassuming and kind, offering what help she could without drawing attention. A few passengers in the seated section noticed her standing there, their faces reflecting a mix of curiosity and mild interest. She held their gazes briefly, her expression calm, perhaps a little amused. They didn't know who she was, what she had achieved, or what she represented. To them, she was just an elderly woman who didn't belong in the world of status and wealth, a passenger who had somehow found herself in the wrong place. Little did they know the true story behind her quiet presence on that train. The train rattled along, the world outside blurring into a mix of trees, fields, and distant towns. The elderly woman remained in her spot, one hand on the rail, the other clutching her leather bag. As she gazed out the window, her fingers traced the bag's worn edges, feeling the rough leather and its familiar warmth, like an old friend who had been with her through every challenge and triumph. A passenger from the seated section, a middle-aged man with a neatly pressed suit and polished shoes, caught her eye and looked at her thoughtfully. He seemed to recognize something about her, perhaps a glimmer of familiarity. He leaned forward, tilting his head, then gave her a slight nod as if acknowledging something only he understood. She returned his gaze with a gentle nod of her own, a silent acknowledgement that passed between them, unnoticed by others. He hesitated, almost as if he wanted to say something, but then turned away, leaving her standing there with the unspoken connection hanging in the air. Meanwhile, the inspector returned, making his way through the train to check tickets in the seated area. When he reached her standing area, he cast her a brief, indifferent glance before continuing on, his gaze lingering for a moment longer than before. His lips twitched in a faint smirk, as though he found it amusing that she hadn't complained or tried to secure a seat for herself. It was as if her silence reinforced his assumption that she didn't belong among the other passengers. He moved on without a word, but she noticed his glance, reading the unspoken dismissal in his eyes. As the inspector passed, a few murmurs started among the nearby passengers. A woman seated nearby whispered to her friend, "It's strange, isn't it? She doesn't look like the type to be standing. I wonder if she's waiting for someone." Her friend shrugged, a hint of curiosity crossing her face as she glanced toward the elderly woman. "Maybe she's just used to it," the friend replied, brushing off the thought, though her eyes lingered, trying to make sense of the quiet dignity in the woman's stance. Another passenger, a young man sitting with his laptop, overheard the exchange and looked up, studying the elderly woman for a moment before returning to his screen. He seemed intrigued, sensing that there was more to her story than met the eye. But like the others, he didn't ask. He simply watched, curiosity simmering just beneath the surface. The woman herself remained calm, observing the small flickers of interest around her, but saying nothing. She allowed the quiet glances and whispers to pass over her, each one only adding to the veil of mystery surrounding her presence. Her eyes sparkled slightly, as though she found amusement in the assumptions people made. Her silence was not a result of weakness or deference. It was a choice, a quiet strength, one that allowed her to see the world as it was, with all its subtle judgments and misunderstandings. As the train moved steadily forward, the passengers in her section grew more curious, yet no one dared to break the silence with direct questions. They watched her with a growing sense of intrigue, sensing that there was something extraordinary about this ordinary-looking woman, something that hadn't yet revealed itself, but was waiting just beneath the surface, like a story waiting to be told. The train's steady motion lulled into a gentle rhythm, yet the air in the cabin grew tense with a growing sense of curiosity. The elderly woman held herself with a graceful stillness, as if she were entirely unaffected by the discomfort and crowded space around her. Her gaze drifted around the car, observing each passenger in quiet contemplation, her eyes warm but reflective, like someone carrying a world of experiences inside them. Moments later, another figure made his way through the train car, dressed in a crisply pressed conductor's uniform. The conductor was an older man with a no-nonsense demeanor, his eyes sharp as he surveyed the passengers. He noticed the murmurs and hushed glances directed at the elderly woman, who stood calmly amidst the shifting energy of the car. His brows furrowed as he took in her dignified bearing, something about her presence seeming out of place. The conductor approached the inspector who had earlier dismissed her, exchanging a few low words. The inspector shrugged, clearly indifferent, waving a hand in her direction as if to suggest she was merely another passenger who could be overlooked. Yet, the conductor's expression darkened slightly, his gaze shifting to the woman with a look that was harder to read. He seemed uncertain, as though something about her face, her quiet strength, tugged at a memory that hovered on the edge of recognition. As the conductor stepped toward her, the elderly woman turned her gaze to meet his, a glimmer of amusement in her eyes. She gave him a small, polite nod, as though she were acknowledging an old acquaintance. Her calmness took him aback for a moment, and he cleared his throat before addressing her. "Ma'am," he began respectfully, though his voice held an edge of formality. "May I help you with anything? It appears you don't have a seat. Perhaps you were unaware, but this section is for passengers with reserved seating." The woman tilted her head slightly, a gentle smile gracing her lips as she responded. "Thank you, but I'm quite comfortable here," she replied. Her voice was soft but carried a tone of assurance, one that hinted she was not someone who would be easily moved. The conductor hesitated, his gaze narrowing as he tried to understand this unusual passenger. "It's just that we typically don't have standing passengers in this car," he continued, his voice laced with a blend of curiosity and respect. He was used to dealing with difficult passengers' complaints and people vying for comfort. Yet this woman was different. She had made no complaints, no requests. She simply stood there holding her ground with a quiet dignity that baffled him. One of the seated passengers leaned forward, clearly unable to contain her curiosity any longer. "Excuse me, miss," the woman called out, her voice tentative but polite. "Are you waiting for someone? Or perhaps, are you related to someone who works on this railway?" Her question hung in the air, and several other passengers turned their attention toward the elderly woman, anticipation flickering in their eyes. The elderly woman regarded the question with a thoughtful expression, as though she found it amusing. She let a few seconds pass, creating a small, expectant silence before she replied. "I suppose you could say I am familiar with these tracks," she said softly, her eyes taking on a distant look, as if recalling something that only she could see. "I have spent many years on these routes, long enough to know every turn, every station, and every mile of steel beneath us." Her words lingered, carrying a weight that hinted at a deeper story. The passengers nearby exchanged puzzled looks, sensing that there was more behind her calm words. A few of them leaned in closer, intrigued by the unexpected response, while the conductor seemed to study her more intently, his brow furrowing with the faintest trace of realization. The woman's hand rested gently on her leather bag, fingers brushing over its surface, as though it were a link to her past. She could feel the weight of the documents inside, the faded photograph, and the official papers that held her name intertwined with the history of this very railway. She had carried this bag through countless journeys, from the days when she struggled to make ends meet to the days when she had finally earned her place at the top of her world. And yet, here she was, standing like an ordinary passenger, unnoticed and unappreciated by most around her. The conductor cleared his throat again, trying to maintain his authority but clearly unsettled. "Forgive me for asking, ma'am, but you seem to know quite a bit about the railway. Might I ask if you have some connection to it?" The elderly woman looked him in the eyes, her expression serene yet piercing. "One could say that this railway and I go back a long way," she replied, her voice steady, her words precise. "It's been quite a journey to get here, you might say. One that wasn't always easy, but one I don't regret." Her words were calm, yet the passengers around her felt a strange chill, as if they were hearing something profound, something that held a mystery yet to be fully understood. The conductor's eyes widened slightly, a look of suspicion and awe beginning to form as the truth crept closer, hovering just out of reach, like the edge of a secret she chose not to share. Not yet. The other passengers, too, sensed that something important was hidden beneath her words, their curiosity growing, pulling them into the quiet mystery of who this woman might truly be. The murmurs around her grew louder as passengers exchanged glances, each one wondering if the elderly woman was more than she seemed. Whispers spread through the car, curiosity ignited by the way she held herself, the calm authority in her voice, and the mystery that surrounded her presence. A young man sitting nearby, unable to resist the allure of her enigma, leaned forward, glancing at her with a mixture of admiration and confusion. One of the staff members, who had been standing by the door, observed the growing interest around the woman and smirked, clearly unconvinced that she was anyone important. He nudged his colleague, speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Looks like we've got a celebrity on board." His mocking tone earned a few awkward chuckles from other passengers, though most shot him disapproving glances. The elderly woman didn't respond, her expression remaining composed as she focused her gaze out the window, watching the scenery blur by. It was as if she had heard these kinds of comments many times before, and knew better than to engage. Her silence, however, only added to the intrigue, as those around her began to wonder if this quiet, unassuming woman might hold more power than anyone suspected. The young mother she had helped earlier gave the staff member a disapproving look, then turned to the elderly woman with a kind smile. "It's nice to see someone with such patience," she said softly, her voice filled with admiration. "Not many people would just stand here, taking everything so calmly." The elderly woman smiled back at her, her eyes warm. "Patience, my dear, is something that life teaches you," she replied, her tone gentle yet wise. "The more you have to wait, the more you come to appreciate the journey itself." As she spoke, her hand brushed against the leather bag once more, her fingers pausing over a certain part of it. Hidden inside was a small, faded emblem stitched into the lining, a logo of the railway itself, a mark of ownership that she had earned through years of hard work. She thought of the days when she had been just like these passengers, traveling on crowded trains, standing for hours without complaint, dreaming of a better life for herself and her family. She glanced at the passengers around her, feeling a quiet sense of connection with them. They were unaware of the countless hours she had spent building something that would last beyond her lifetime, unaware that she had fought battles to claim her place in a world that hadn't been welcoming. The railway had become a part of her legacy, woven into her life as deeply as the lines on her palms. Yet here she was, standing humbly, without demanding recognition or privilege. At that moment, a middle-aged man with silver hair and a sharp suit, seated a few rows down, lifted his gaze, recognizing her with a start. His eyes widened as he realized who she was. He leaned forward, his gaze flickering between her and the inspector, a look of disbelief settling on his face. He began to rise, as if to approach her, but hesitated, clearly unsure of how to proceed. The elderly woman noticed him, and she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, signaling him to remain seated. She understood the power of her anonymity and chose to keep it, letting this journey unfold without revealing her true identity. At least, not yet. The man nodded back respectfully, lowering himself into his seat, yet his gaze never left her. It was as if he had just witnessed a ghost, someone he never thought he'd see in such humble surroundings. The passengers around them noticed the exchange, their interest piqued further. Now, more than ever, they sensed something extraordinary about this woman. She held an aura of quiet authority, as if she had come not just as a traveler, but as an observer, studying them, taking in their reactions and attitudes without judgment. Her silence spoke volumes, leaving them more curious with every passing moment. As the train pulled into the next station, a few new passengers boarded, filling the remaining seats. The elderly woman remained where she was, untouched by the rush and noise around her, still holding her quiet, mysterious vigil by the window. The conductor, who had been watching her with a growing sense of intrigue, approached again, this time with more respect in his tone. "Ma'am," he said, his voice softer now, If you'd like, I can arrange for a seat. I apologize for any misunderstanding earlier." She looked at him kindly, a trace of amusement in her eyes. "Thank you," she replied, "but I'm quite all right here. It's been a while since I've had a journey like this. It reminds me of the old days." Her voice was filled with nostalgia, a hint of a past that few around her could understand. The conductor nodded slowly, his curiosity deepening. There was something in her words that resonated with him, something that made him feel he was speaking not to a mere passenger, but to someone who held a story too important to be ignored. As he moved away, he exchanged a knowing glance with a few other staff members, each of them sensing that this was no ordinary encounter. The passengers, too, watched her in silence, their imaginations running wild, each wondering who she could possibly be and why she had chosen to travel this way. The truth lingered just out of reach, like a puzzle missing its final piece, a secret waiting to be uncovered. And in her silence, she let them wonder, holding them in suspense as if she knew that the journey itself held lessons that words could never teach. As the train continued down the tracks, the anticipation around her only grew, the air thick with unspoken questions. The elderly woman, however, remained as calm as ever, her hands resting lightly on her bag, her gaze focused somewhere distant, as if she were seeing beyond the present moment. Every so often she would glance around, her eyes lingering briefly on the faces of her fellow passengers, studying them, almost as though she were remembering something, perhaps seeing echoes of her own past in each one of them. The murmurs hadn't stopped. Small groups of passengers leaned in to whisper, casting curious glances her way, each building their own theories. Some believed she was someone important, perhaps even a former employee of the railway. Others suggested she might be the relative of an influential figure, someone whose presence was powerful enough to command respect even without a title. Still, the whispers held a tone of admiration mixed with confusion. Who was this mysterious woman? And why was she here, standing among them, seemingly unfazed by the humble position she had taken? Meanwhile, the young inspector, noticing the ongoing attention she was drawing, began to feel uneasy. He had dismissed her earlier without a second thought, assuming her silence meant acceptance, yet something about her presence was beginning to unsettle him. The fact that she had taken her place without complaint, without questioning or asserting herself, made him wonder if he had misjudged her. He had expected her to speak up, to demand more, yet she had done neither, choosing instead to watch and wait. At the back of the train car, a young woman with a notebook sat observing the scene. She had noticed the elderly woman's quiet authority from the moment she boarded, and had been scribbling small notes, capturing the dynamics unfolding before her. The young woman worked as a journalist, always on the lookout for human interest stories, and something about the dignified silence of the elderly woman intrigued her. She sensed that there was a story hidden beneath that gentle demeanor, one that was waiting to be told, but only if she approached it with the right questions. Finally, the young journalist gathered her courage and moved closer, her notebook in hand, her curiosity sparking with every step. She approached slowly, her voice soft as she spoke to the elderly woman, careful not to disturb her peace. "Excuse me, ma'am," she began, offering a respectful smile. "I couldn't help but notice how calmly you've handled, well, everything today. It's rare to see someone so composed. May I ask, do you travel often?" The elderly woman turned, her eyes meeting the young journalist's with a warmth that seemed to recognize a kindred spirit. "I used to travel quite a bit," she answered, her voice carrying a softness laced with strength. "These days, not so much, but when I do, I like to see how things have changed, and how much has stayed the same." The journalist nodded, sensing a depth to her words. "I see. And do you have a favorite memory from your travels?" she asked, hoping to peel back another layer of the mystery surrounding her. A gentle smile crossed the elderly woman's lips, her eyes gleaming with a flicker of nostalgia. "Ah, there are too many memories to count," she replied, her voice touched with a wistful note. but perhaps the ones that stand out are those where I felt the weight of every step I took, the days when each mile meant more than just distance. You see, I didn't travel for leisure back then. I traveled with purpose. Her words hung in the air, layered with meaning, leaving the young journalist spellbound. A purpose. That single word carried an intensity that seemed to reverberate through the train car, drawing the attention of nearby passengers. Even the conductor, standing a few feet away, seemed to pause, as though the significance of her words had reached him as well. The journalist leaned in slightly, sensing she was close to uncovering a truth, a story that felt almost sacred. "If you don't mind me asking, what was that purpose?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The elderly woman considered the question, her expression softening as her fingers traced the worn handle of her bag. She let a few beats of silence pass, as though weighing how much to share. Finally she spoke, her voice steady, carrying a quiet power. "Purpose can be a heavy thing, my dear," she said, her tone gentle but firm. "In my case, it meant fighting for something that others believed I didn't deserve. It meant working, not for recognition, but for the simple right to stand where I do today. There were many who told me I couldn't, and even more who believed I shouldn't. But I decided, long ago, that I would carve my own path." Her words stirred something deep within the listeners, a respect that went beyond mere curiosity. Passengers sat up, eyes fixed on her as they absorbed her story in silence, each word carrying a weight that spoke of resilience, of battles fought quietly and won against all odds. She did not boast or elaborate. Her words were simple, yet they spoke of strength that could only come from experience. The young journalist felt a surge of admiration, realizing she was in the presence of someone truly remarkable, someone whose quiet humility concealed a life of unimaginable determination. She sensed the layers to the woman's story, but understood, in that moment, that this was a tale that couldn't be rushed or prodded into the open. It would be revealed on its own terms, in its own time. As the elderly woman returned her gaze to the passing landscape, the journalist took a respectful step back, feeling that she had been granted a glimpse into something rare and beautiful. And around them, the passengers remained silent, feeling the weight of what had just been shared, as if they were on the brink of discovering something monumental, something that would change the way they saw her forever. As the train journey continued, the silence in the car grew heavier, weighted by the elderly woman's words. Passengers who had been restless or distracted now sat quietly, glancing her way with newfound respect. Her calm, mysterious presence seemed to shift the energy in the car, leaving them to wonder just what struggles lay behind her gentle smile and steady gaze. Each one held their own interpretation, piecing together their own version of her story, yet none came close to understanding the truth. In one corner, the inspector, who had initially dismissed her, was beginning to feel increasingly uncomfortable. He was no stranger to passengers of all kinds, some demanding, others meek, a few with hidden stories. Yet something about this woman's quiet dignity unnerved him. The way she had simply accepted her standing position, unbothered by his disregard, made him feel as though he had missed something crucial about her. Determined to prove his earlier assumptions right, the inspector approached her once more, his stance rigid, his expression unreadable. He cleared his throat, addressing her in a louder voice than necessary, trying to reassert his authority. "Ma'am, I don't mean to intrude," he said, a hint of impatience in his tone. "But it seems you've caught everyone's attention. Are you sure you don't need assistance finding a seat? It's quite unusual to see someone standing so patiently, especially at your stage in life." The elderly woman looked up, her eyes meeting his with a calm, penetrating gaze that made him falter for a brief moment. There was no anger or irritation in her expression, only a quiet confidence that made him feel oddly exposed, as if she could see straight through him. She held his gaze for a heartbeat longer, letting the silence speak for itself before she finally replied. "Thank you for your concern," she said gently, her voice carrying a subtle authority that seemed to strip away any assumptions about her. "But as I mentioned, I am quite comfortable here. I've spent my whole life standing, Inspector, and I've learned that sometimes when you stand long enough, you start to see things others might overlook." The inspector's face flushed slightly, her words striking a nerve he hadn't expected. Her tone was not confrontational, yet there was something powerful in the way she spoke, as though she were speaking from experience far deeper than he could understand. He opened his mouth to respond, but the weight of her words silenced him. Slowly, he nodded, a glimmer of realization dawning in his eyes, though he struggled to fully grasp it. At that moment, a man seated nearby, dressed in a well-tailored suit and looking every bit the seasoned businessman, leaned forward, his curiosity getting the better of him. He had been observing the exchanges with growing fascination, sensing a story that ran far deeper than anyone else in the car might suspect. Clearing his throat politely, he addressed the elderly woman, his voice respectful. "Excuse me, ma'am," he began. "I don't mean to intrude, but I must say I find your resilience admirable. Not many people would handle a journey like this with such grace." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "You mentioned purpose earlier. It's not often I meet someone who speaks of it with such conviction. If you don't mind me asking, what line of work did you pursue with such dedication?" The elderly woman studied him, her eyes warm and contemplative, as if she were deciding how much to share. She gave a small nod, acknowledging the question, then spoke with a touch of humor in her voice. "Let's just say, I've spent most of my life working with iron and steel," she replied, her tone cryptic yet meaningful. "I've watched these tracks lay down, one by one, and seen towns grow from mere stations into bustling centers of life. I've come to know each stretch, each curve, and every crossing along these rails." The businessman's eyes widened slightly as her words sank in, realizing she wasn't speaking of the railway as an observer, but as someone who had shaped it, molded it, as if it were her own. An awe-filled silence fell over the car as other passengers who had been listening quietly began to understand the deeper connection she held with the railway. The inspector, too, looked stunned, his earlier indifference replaced with a dawning comprehension that unsettled him. The woman's words stirred an almost reverent curiosity among those nearby, as if she had pulled back the curtain to reveal a history they had been blind to, a legacy hidden in plain sight. One passenger, a young man who had been silent until now, couldn't contain his curiosity any longer. "Are you saying you built this railway?" he asked, his voice filled with disbelief, his gaze locked onto her as if seeing her for the first time. The elderly woman smiled, a small knowing smile that hinted at countless stories left untold. "Built? No," she said softly, her voice carrying a sense of both pride and humility. "But I did help it grow. I've been a part of its journey, just as it's been a part of mine." Her words hung in the air, powerful in their simplicity. She had not claimed ownership, nor had she demanded recognition. Yet, those around her sensed the gravity of her role, realizing that this was no ordinary passenger. This was someone who had shaped the very path they traveled, someone who had stood at the heart of the railway's history, working tirelessly to create the journey they now took for granted. The conductor, who had been listening nearby, felt a surge of respect and awe. He looked at her, his voice barely a whisper. "Ma'am, may I ask, what is your name?" The elderly woman paused, her eyes reflecting years of stories, struggles, and triumphs. She looked at him, her gaze steady, a faint smile playing on her lips. After a moment she replied, her voice resonating with quiet strength. "Names are only part of the story, dear," she said gently. "But you may call me Miriam." And with that the passengers sat in reverent silence, letting the weight of her words sink in, feeling as though they were in the presence of someone truly extraordinary, someone who carried the spirit of the railway in her very soul. The train rattled forward, the rhythm of its wheels blending with the low hum of conversation that had taken on a more reverent tone. Each passenger who had witnessed Miriam's quiet revelations now regarded her with respect and a sense of awe, realizing that they were in the company of someone who had played a monumental role in shaping the very path they traveled. Miriam remained standing, her gaze soft as she looked out over the passing countryside. Her presence now commanded a quiet reverence, as if the entire car sensed the dignity she carried. It was the young journalist who finally broke the silence, her voice a gentle thread weaving through the stillness. "Mrs. Miriam," she said tentatively, leaning forward with a notebook in hand, "if it's not too much to ask, would you share a bit more about what it was like to work on the railway all these years? I think everyone here would love to hear more." Miriam's eyes softened, a faint smile touching her lips as she regarded the journalist and the attentive passengers around her. "Well," she began, her voice a blend of nostalgia and wisdom, "I didn't start as someone of importance. I was a young woman then, not much older than you." She nodded toward the journalist. "And back in those days, women, especially women like me, weren't expected to be anywhere near the operations of a railway." A murmur of surprise rippled through the car. Miriam's words painted a picture of a time when things were different, harder, and those who didn't fit the norm had to fight even for the smallest opportunities. She continued, her voice gentle but unwavering. "When I first came to the railway, I was given the simplest of tasks. I worked as a cleaner, then as a porter, carrying luggage and helping passengers find their way. I used to stand on these very platforms, feeling the weight of each journey as I watched people come and go, wondering if I'd ever get to see more of the world myself." Her voice grew soft, filled with memories that seemed almost tangible. She glanced down at her leather bag, her fingers brushing its worn handle as if it were a relic from that past. "But I learned quickly, watching every movement, every detail. I became familiar with the railway's heartbeat, the engines, the schedules, the tracks that crisscrossed from town to town. And when the time was right, I pushed my way into roles that no one thought I could do." A few passengers leaned forward, caught up in her story, while the young inspector looked on, his face reflecting a mix of admiration and regret for his earlier disregard. Miriam continued, her voice steady. "It wasn't an easy path," she said, her tone laced with a quiet pride. "I faced more than a few challenges, some harsh words, plenty of doubt. But I pushed on day by day, learning everything I could. Eventually I earned respect, earned my place here. I started managing logistics, then maintenance, and slowly I rose through the ranks. It took years, but eventually the railway became more than just a job to me. It became a legacy." A hush fell over the car as her words settled in, the enormity of her journey dawning on each listener. They could see it now, the grit, the perseverance, the battles she had fought silently out of the spotlight. Miriam had transformed herself from a simple worker into a true force within the railway, someone who had poured her life into its growth, forging a path that others had walked on without even realizing it. One of the passengers, an older man sitting near the window, leaned forward, his voice respectful. "Mrs. Miriam," he said, "you must have seen so much change over the years. Did you ever think of giving up?" Miriam smiled, a small, sad smile that carried the weight of 1,000 memories. "Oh, there were days I thought about it," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Days when I wondered if it was worth it, if I was truly making a difference. But each time I reminded myself of the people who depended on me, the lives that moved along these tracks. It wasn't just about me. It was about everyone who took these journeys, everyone who trusted us to get them safely to their destination." The passengers listened, enraptured by her story, each one feeling as though they had glimpsed a rare piece of history that few ever knew existed. And in that moment, Miriam was no longer just an elderly woman standing quietly by the window. She was the living heartbeat of the railway, a testament to resilience, purpose, and the power of an unyielding spirit. She looked around, meeting each gaze with a calm, steady look. "I may no longer be involved in the daily operations," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "But this railway will always be a part of me. Every track, every station, Every train carries a piece of my story, and I am proud to have been part of something that will continue long after I am gone." The train car fell into a reverent silence, each passenger deeply moved, as if they had just experienced something sacred, a piece of history that had come alive before them. They no longer saw her as an ordinary traveler, but as a symbol of strength and resilience, a reminder of what one person could achieve against the odds. The young journalist put her notebook down, realizing that no words could fully capture what Miriam had just shared. She simply nodded, a tear glistening in her eye, as if to say that she understood, and that she would carry this story forward, just as Miriam had carried the legacy of the railway all these years. The train continued along its path, winding through the countryside as the passengers sat in a reflective silence, each absorbing Miriam's story in their own way. The young inspector, who had initially dismissed her so easily, now looked at her with a mixture of respect and regret. He shifted uncomfortably, feeling the weight of his earlier assumptions, as though realizing for the first time the depth of his error. Unable to keep his thoughts to himself any longer, he approached her cautiously, his voice much softer than before. "Mrs. Miriam," he began, clearing his throat, I owe you an apology. I didn't treat you with the respect you deserve. I didn't realize, I didn't know who you were." Miriam turned to him, her expression kind yet knowing. "That's all right, young man," she replied gently, with a slight smile that seemed to ease his discomfort. "Sometimes it takes a while for people to see beyond what's in front of them. You're not the first to make that mistake, and you won't be the last." Her words, spoken without bitterness or resentment, seemed to soothe the inspector. He nodded, feeling a strange gratitude for her grace. "Thank you," he said, sincerity clear in his voice. "I'll remember this. I'll try to see people for who they are, not just for what I assume." Miriam's eyes sparkled slightly, a hint of warmth and understanding in her gaze. "That's all anyone can ask," she replied. Then, after a brief pause, she added, "Remember, the journey shapes us all. Sometimes we just need to look a little closer to see its meaning." The inspector took her words to heart, feeling as though he'd learned a lesson that went far beyond this single journey. As he stepped away, the passengers who had witnessed their exchange looked at Miriam with a deeper appreciation, sensing that she had just offered them all a piece of wisdom that would stay with them long after the journey had ended. As the train approached another station, the passengers prepared for the usual shuffle of arrivals and departures. But this time, there was a palpable shift in the air, a sense of heightened awareness, as if every soul in that car felt they were part of something extraordinary. Miriam's presence had turned their ordinary journey into a story they'd carry forward, each of them touched by her resilience and quiet wisdom. A few seats away, an elderly gentleman, whose attire hinted at a lifetime of hard work, adjusted his glasses and leaned forward, speaking softly, almost reverently. "Mrs. Miriam," he began, his voice filled with respect, "if you don't mind me asking, what kept you going all these years? To keep fighting, to hold on? It must have been difficult." Miriam looked at him, her expression softening as though she understood the question ran deeper than mere curiosity. "It was difficult," she acknowledged, her voice steady yet thoughtful. "But I believed in something larger than myself. This railway wasn't just steel and tracks to me. It was a bridge, a way to connect people, to bring them closer, to help them reach their dreams. And that's what kept me going, the thought that each train, each journey, could carry someone towards something better." The passengers listened intently, her words resonating with each of them in different ways. Her purpose, rooted not in personal gain but in service to others, left an impact that words couldn't fully capture. She hadn't simply worked to build a railway. She had worked to build a path for countless lives. The young mother she had helped earlier wiped a tear from her eye, nodding in quiet admiration. She too felt a connection to Miriam's purpose, sensing that her journey was not so different. Every effort, every sacrifice she made was for the betterment of her child, to give him a future filled with hope and possibility. As the train slowed to a stop at the station, A few passengers exited, but many who might have disembarked chose to stay, unable to pull themselves away from this shared moment of connection. And in the midst of it all, Miriam remained as steady as ever, her presence reminding them that sometimes the most powerful journeys were those that happened within. As the train continued on its journey, the passengers who had chosen to stay looked around the car, feeling an unspoken bond that had formed among them. Each was wrapped in their own thoughts, but the experience of being in Miriam's presence seemed to draw them together, creating a quiet, shared reverence for this unexpected story they were now part of. A sense of community had emerged, one that transcended their backgrounds, statuses, and destinations. The young journalist, still intrigued by Miriam's wisdom, felt a growing need to capture this story in a way that would honor her legacy. She inched closer again, her voice soft but insistent with curiosity. "Mrs. Miriam," she asked gently, "if there was one thing you wanted people to remember about your journey, something to pass on to others, what would it be?" Miriam turned to her, her face serene, her eyes holding a depth that seemed to span generations. She took a deep breath, as if weighing her words carefully, knowing they would become part of this young woman's narrative, carried forward beyond this train car. "If there's one thing I'd wish people to remember," she began thoughtfully, "it would be that no one's journey is ever wasted. Every step we take, every struggle we endure, it shapes us in ways we might not see at first. And someday, when we least expect it, we find ourselves exactly where we're meant to be, often in ways we never imagined." The journalist nodded, scribbling furiously in her notebook, her eyes shining with admiration. Miriam's words felt like a gift, a reminder that even the seemingly small moments, the unnoticed sacrifices, and the struggles that felt isolating could lead to something profound, something that might impact others in ways unseen. The businessman, who had initially shown skepticism but was now clearly captivated, leaned forward, eager to understand the heart of Miriam's journey. "Miriam," he said respectfully, "if you'll allow me to ask, when you finally reached the top, when you became a leader within the railway, did you find it fulfilling? Did it give you everything you had hoped for?" Miriam's gaze softened, her fingers lightly tracing the leather of her bag as though the answer was held within its worn surface. "In many ways it did," she answered slowly, "but in many others it taught me even more than I could have dreamed. Achieving a goal doesn't mean that the challenges end. In fact, they grow. There are new responsibilities, new burdens, and often a greater sense of loneliness. But I found joy in knowing that what I was building wasn't just for myself. It was for the people who traveled these tracks, for those who depended on us. That gave my work meaning beyond anything personal." She paused, her expression tinged with a hint of sadness, as though she were recalling the weight of her leadership, the decisions she had made, and the sacrifices that few knew about. "The higher I rose, the more I understood that leadership isn't about being at the top," she continued. "It's about being at the heart of something. It's about carrying the weight so that others can walk their path a little easier, even if they never know who helped pave the way." The passengers sat in a reflective silence, her words resonating with each one of them in different ways. The businessman, who had spent his life chasing success, seemed visibly moved, as though he were seeing his own journey through a new lens. He leaned back, his expression thoughtful, understanding perhaps for the first time that true success went beyond titles or accolades. It lay in the impact one left on the lives of others. In a quiet corner, the young mother who had been helped by Miriam earlier clutched her child a little closer, drawing inspiration from this woman's story. She looked at her son, her eyes filled with a new resolve. She too was building a legacy, one not measured by wealth or status, but by the love and strength she could pass on to him, just as Miriam had given so much to countless strangers. The inspector, standing by the doorway, looked down at his hands, recalling the countless passengers he had brushed off or ignored over the years. Miriam's words had left him reflecting on his own role, his own responsibilities. He now saw his job not just as a duty, but as a chance to be part of something larger, a network of people and stories interconnected through the journey they shared on these very rails. He resolved quietly to approach his work with more compassion, more understanding, knowing that each passenger he encountered carried a story of their own. As the train approached another station, a few more passengers prepared to disembark. Yet, once again, many who had intended to leave chose to remain. They were no longer simply passengers on a train. They were witnesses to a living testament of resilience, a story that had unfolded quietly among them, binding them together in a way they hadn't anticipated. Those who did leave cast lingering glances back at Miriam, as if saying silent goodbyes to someone who had shifted their perspectives, even in a brief moment. And as the train pressed onward, Miriam sat quietly, a gentle smile on her face. She was aware of the impact she had left, aware that her journey, shared in small fragments with those around her, had left an impression that would stay with them far beyond this single ride. She had not set out to change anyone's mind or heart that day. She had simply been herself, and that had been enough. As the miles slipped by, the passengers were left with the profound feeling that they had been part of something much more than a simple journey from one station to another. They were part of a legacy woven through the life of an unassuming woman who had built bridges of steel and heart, who had shaped tracks not only through the land, but through the lives of everyone who crossed her path. The landscape outside shifted subtly as the train moved forward, the scenery becoming a blend of rolling hills and distant towns. Inside the car, the passengers remained quiet, each one immersed in thoughts stirred by Miriam's story. It felt as though time itself had slowed, allowing them to savor the significance of each word she had shared. They had started this journey as strangers, but her presence had connected them, giving them a sense of unity that lingered in the air. The young journalist continued jotting down notes, capturing Miriam's words with care, yet her mind was racing with a question she hadn't yet dared to ask. She wanted to know what drove Miriam beyond personal ambition, what truly lay at the heart of her determination. Gathering her courage, she approached Miriam once more, speaking in a soft voice. "Miriam, you've given us so much insight into your journey, but I can't help but wonder, was there someone or something that inspired you to keep going, even when the path was hardest?" Her voice was respectful, aware of the weight of her question. Miriam looked at her with a thoughtful smile, her eyes glistening with memories that felt both near and distant. "Yes," she replied after a pause. "My mother was my inspiration. She was a woman of strength and humility, someone who saw dignity in hard work and value in every kindness. She taught me to believe in myself, even when the world tried to convince me otherwise." Her voice softened, carrying a hint of reverence. "My mother taught me that I was more than just the circumstances I was born into. She always said that if I worked with integrity and heart, I'd make a difference, even if the world never noticed. And so, I carried her words with me through every long day and sleepless night, every setback and triumph. In a way, this railway, it became my way of honoring her, of giving back the love and courage she gave me." The journalist's eyes brimmed with tears as she scribbled down Miriam's words, realizing that this legacy was not only about steel tracks and engines, but about a lineage of strength and resilience passed down from one generation to the next. Miriam's mother, though gone, lived on through her, shaping each mile of the railway with unseen hands. The businessman, overhearing the exchange, looked up with renewed respect. "It's remarkable," he said, "how one person's legacy can extend so far, touching lives in ways they never could have imagined. You've built more than a railway, Miriam. You've built a path that others can follow whether they know it or not." Miriam nodded, her smile deepening. "That's the beauty of it, isn't it?" she said quietly. "We never know how far our actions will go or who they might help, but I like to think that each of us, in our own way, is leaving behind a bridge for someone else." The train moved on, the landscape outside shifting into the golden light of the approaching evening. The passengers who remained had settled into a contemplative silence, as if Miriam's story had left them all searching within themselves, reflecting on their own journeys and the legacies they might one day leave behind. It was as though they had become part of an unspoken pact, each one carrying forward a piece of Miriam's wisdom in their own heart. The inspector, still stationed near the door, looked out over the passengers with a new sense of responsibility. His earlier impatience had melted into a deep respect, and he felt a quiet urge to address Miriam one last time before their journey ended. He approached her cautiously, as if not to disturb her thoughts, and cleared his throat. "Mrs. Miriam," he said softly, "I just wanted to say that I've learned something today, something important. I've been doing this job for years, seeing thousands of faces, but I've never really looked, if you understand me. I've always just assumed." Miriam's expression softened, and she nodded in understanding. "That's not uncommon," she replied gently. "Sometimes the roles we take on in life can blind us to the people standing right in front of us. But the beauty of a journey is that it can change us, open our eyes to see what was there all along." The inspector felt her words settle into his mind like a balm, easing the regret that had gnawed at him since he first dismissed her. He took a deep breath, a look of quiet gratitude crossing his face. "Thank you, Mrs. Miriam. I'll carry this lesson with me. I promise I'll look closer from now on." Miriam's smile was warm and encouraging. "That's all any of us can do," she said. "Just look closer, treat others with kindness, and remember that everyone is carrying their own story, just like you." The inspector nodded, her words leaving a mark on him he knew would stay. He stepped back, allowing the lesson she had imparted to settle in fully, feeling as though he had been given a second chance to see the world with more compassion and understanding. And as he returned to his post, he looked over the passengers in the car with fresh eyes, understanding, perhaps for the first time, the profound privilege of sharing even a brief journey with others. As the train continued on, the glow of evening began to cast a warm light over the car, creating an intimate, reflective atmosphere. The passengers sat quietly, each one carrying Miriam's story within them, transformed by the experience. Some looked out the window, others closed their eyes, and all seemed to be processing the quiet yet profound lesson she had offered. It was as if her words had woven an invisible thread between them, connecting each passenger with a shared sense of purpose and compassion. The young mother who had been helped by Miriam earlier looked down at her child, stroking his hair gently as he slept against her shoulder. Miriam's story had touched her deeply, reminding her of her own journey and the sacrifices she made for her family. She realized that her small, everyday acts of love and patience were her own legacy, one that her son would carry forward, just as Miriam had carried her mother's wisdom. She glanced at Miriam with a look of gratitude, silently vowing to pass down the strength and resilience she had seen in this remarkable woman. As the train approached another stop, a group of new passengers boarded, filling the remaining seats and unaware of the profound experience shared in this car. They looked around curiously, sensing the unusual silence, and one or two passengers glanced at Miriam, who continued to stand, steady and calm. Some of the newcomers seemed puzzled by the attention she received, unable to grasp the respect and reverence that had formed around her. One of the new passengers, a well-dressed man carrying a leather briefcase, took note of the empty seats around him and raised an eyebrow. He looked over at Miriam, his expression skeptical as he saw her standing among the seated passengers. With a dismissive tone, he said, "Excuse me, ma'am. Are you sure you're in the right section? This area is for reserved seating." The other passengers shifted uncomfortably, glancing at each other, but no one spoke. The businessman, who had earlier shown a renewed respect for Miriam, cleared his throat, looking prepared to interject. But before he could, Miriam turned to the newcomer with a gentle smile. "I'm right where I need to be," she replied softly, her voice calm yet carrying a quiet strength. There was no anger in her tone, no defensiveness, only the wisdom of someone who had encountered these situations many times before. The well-dressed man seemed taken aback by her response, frowning slightly, but the other passengers simply watched, silently unified in their respect for Miriam. The tension in the car dissolved as quickly as it had formed, the newcomer looking away awkwardly, his discomfort visible, as he sensed the unspoken bond that Miriam had woven among the others. One of the seated passengers, an older woman who had listened quietly to Miriam's story, leaned forward, offering her seat with a warm smile. "Please, Mrs. Miriam," she said, her voice filled with admiration. "Why don't you take my seat? I insist." But Miriam declined with a kind shake of her head. "Thank you, dear, but I'm quite all right," she said gently. "I've stood for many journeys before, and I've found that you see more that way." The older woman nodded, understanding her words in a way that went beyond their literal meaning. Miriam's choice to stand was not one of necessity but of purpose. It was a testament to her humility, her strength, and the legacy she had built without needing recognition. The businessman leaned toward the young journalist and whispered, "There's something remarkable about her, isn't there? She carries herself like someone who has already achieved more than most people could ever imagine." The journalist nodded, a look of awe in her eyes. "She's built a legacy without even asking for recognition," she replied softly. "And I think that's why her story feels so powerful. She's taught us all that it's the quiet strength, the resilience, and the kindness we show to others that truly last." The journey neared its end as the evening deepened into twilight, the train now moving through fields bathed in the warm glow of the setting sun. A gentle silence fell over the car, as each passenger reflected on the stories and lessons Miriam had shared. They no longer saw her as merely a fellow traveler, but as a beacon of wisdom, someone who had illuminated the value of purpose, resilience, and kindness without uttering a single boast. As the final station approached, the conductor made his way through the car, letting passengers know they would soon be arriving. When he reached Miriam, he stopped, an almost reverent respect in his demeanor. "Mrs. Miriam," he said quietly, "I wanted to thank you. This has been a memorable journey, one that's given us all something to think about." Miriam smiled, nodding gently. "Thank you, young man. The journey teaches us all if we're willing to listen." She looked around at the passengers, meeting each gaze with a warm smile, as if offering them a silent blessing. "Remember, every journey has a purpose. Sometimes it's about where we're going, and sometimes it's about what we leave behind." As the train pulled into the station, the passengers who had shared this extraordinary experience with her began to gather their things. Each of them moved in ways they hadn't expected. They looked at Miriam, reluctant to part, knowing they had been part of something truly special. One by one they disembarked, each casting a final glance her way, some offering quiet nods of respect, others giving her gentle smiles that spoke of their gratitude. The young mother paused as she passed, holding her child close as she looked into Miriam's eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice full of emotion, "for everything." Miriam returned her gaze with a look of understanding. "Take care of him," she replied softly. "He's your legacy. Guide him well." As the last of the passengers exited, the young journalist lingered for a moment, watching Miriam with a look of quiet awe. She felt as though she had been given a gift, a story that was much more than an article. It was a life lesson, one she would carry and pass on, honoring the legacy of a remarkable woman who had touched so many lives. The train finally emptied, and Miriam remained in her place by the window, her presence filling the car with an air of quiet strength. As she looked out, watching the passengers disperse into the night, a gentle smile lingered on her face. She knew her journey had left a mark, one that would ripple out beyond this single ride, carried forward in the hearts of those who had been willing to listen. As the last light of day faded into dusk, Miriam remained by the window, the train car now nearly empty. The world outside seemed peaceful, blanketed in the soft hues of evening, and she watched the quiet beauty of it all, as if seeing it through a lens shaped by years of experience, memories, and meaning. Her presence seemed to linger in the empty car, filling it with a warmth that had no need for company or words. Just then, the young inspector, who had been observing from a distance, stepped forward, his face softened by an expression of deep respect. Miriam's story, her patience, and her quiet dignity had stirred something in him, a realization of the countless faces he had overlooked in his routine. He hesitated for a moment, as if unsure whether to interrupt, then finally spoke, his voice humble. "Mrs. Miriam," he began, clearing his throat, "I just wanted to say that you've made me think about my work in ways I hadn't before. I've spent years seeing passengers come and go, without really seeing them, if you understand me. But you've changed that." Miriam turned to him, her eyes filled with kindness. "That's a good start, young man," she said, her voice soft but encouraging. "Sometimes the best journeys aren't the ones we plan. They're the ones that change us along the way." He nodded, her words sinking into his heart, carrying the weight of a lesson he knew he would carry forward. "Thank you, Mrs. Miriam. I promise I'll treat every passenger with the respect they deserve from now on. You've shown me that everyone has a story worth listening to." Miriam smiled, a look of contentment on her face. "If you do that," she said, "you'll find that the journey itself becomes a gift, not just for those you serve, but for you as well." The inspector bowed his head, his gratitude evident before stepping back and leaving her to her thoughts. As he walked away, he felt a renewed sense of purpose in his role, a sense that he was not just an inspector, but a guide, a witness to countless lives intersecting briefly on this shared path. Moments later, the young journalist returned, unable to leave without one last word with Miriam. She had been deeply moved by her story, inspired by the woman's strength, humility, and quiet impact. Her heart pounded as she approached, the weight of their exchange pressing upon her with a sense of significance. "Mrs. Miriam," she said gently, clutching her notebook, "I wanted to thank you for sharing so much with us. I feel like I've been given a story that's more than just words on a page. It's something that's changed me." Miriam looked at her with a knowing smile, her gaze filled with warmth. "That's what stories are meant to do, dear. They're meant to stay with us, to change us. And one day you'll have your own story to pass on to others, one that holds all the moments, all the people who touched your life." The young journalist nodded, her eyes glistening with emotion. "I promise I'll do justice to your story, Mrs. Miriam. I'll make sure others understand what it means to build something meaningful, to live with purpose." Miriam reached out, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "I trust that you will. And remember, it's not about telling people who we are, but showing them through what we do. Live in a way that speaks for itself, and your legacy will take care of itself." The journalist held back tears, nodding, knowing that Miriam's words were a gift she would carry long after this journey ended. She stepped back, leaving Miriam to her quiet contemplation, feeling as though she had been touched by something extraordinary, something rare and beautiful that would guide her for years to come. As the train prepared to move on to its next destination, the young journalist lingered on the platform, watching through the window as Miriam sat alone, still radiating that same calm presence. And as the train began to pull away, she realized that this wasn't just the end of a journey, but the beginning of a new path, one filled with purpose, shaped by the wisdom of a woman who had taught her more in a single ride than she had learned in a lifetime. As the train pulled away from the station, leaving behind the platform and the young journalist who watched with a lingering gaze, Miriam leaned back, settling into the quiet solitude of the car. The evening had given way to darkness, and the world outside the window was now a shadowed blur, occasionally lit by distant town lights and the soft glow of passing lampposts. The gentle rhythm of the train lulled her into reflection, each passing mile seeming to echo memories from her past. With the car nearly empty, Miriam reached into her worn leather bag, her fingers finding a small, folded photograph that she had carried with her for decades. She held it up to the dim light, a soft smile touching her lips as she looked at the image. A much younger version of herself, standing beside a steam engine, her expression full of pride and determination. Next to her in the photo was her mother, their hands intertwined, both women wearing the same proud, resilient smiles. She traced the outlines of her mother's face, feeling a familiar pang of love and gratitude. Her mother had been the one to instill in her the values she had carried throughout her life: resilience, compassion, and the belief that every person, regardless of their background, held a story worth telling. It was her mother's strength that had been her guide, her unshakable foundation, and in that moment, she felt her presence as if she were right there beside her. Miriam thought back to all the people she had encountered on her journey, the countless lives that had intersected with hers over the years. She had seen their struggles, their triumphs, and their quiet resilience, each of them contributing to the world in their own way. She knew that her purpose had never been about recognition or accolades. It had always been about being part of something larger, something that would continue long after she was gone. With a gentle sigh, she folded the photograph and returned it to her bag, feeling a deep sense of peace. She knew that the passengers who had shared this journey with her would carry forward the lessons she had imparted, perhaps unknowingly passing them on to others, as her mother had done for her. Her legacy was not in the tracks or the trains, but in the hearts of those who had been touched by her kindness, her strength, and her unwavering belief in the value of every person's journey. As the train moved steadily through the night, Miriam closed her eyes, resting her head against the seat. She felt content, knowing that her story had been shared and would continue in ways she could never foresee. Her journey had been long, and though it was nearing its end, she knew that the impact of her life would ripple out, unseen yet everlasting, woven into the lives of those who had listened, understood, and felt inspired by the quiet strength of a woman who had spent her life building bridges, both seen and unseen. The night deepened, casting the train in a comforting quiet as it moved steadily through the dark. Miriam rested peacefully, her eyes closed, lost in memories that drifted through her mind like gentle waves. The rhythm of the train, steady and familiar, was a companion she had known for so many years. Though she was alone in the car now, she felt surrounded by the countless lives she had encountered, the countless stories she had touched. A soft chime indicated that the train was nearing its final stop. Miriam opened her eyes, gathering her things with the calmness of someone who had been through many journeys. The conductor, noticing she was the last remaining passenger, approached her respectfully. "Mrs. Miriam," he said with a gentle smile, "we're arriving at the end of the line. Thank you for everything today. You've given us something to remember, something more meaningful than any regular journey." Miriam returned his smile, her eyes warm with gratitude. "Thank you for listening," she replied. "Remember, every journey has a purpose, even when it doesn't seem clear at first." The conductor nodded, understanding that he had been part of something extraordinary. He extended his hand to help her up, a gesture of respect that reflected the quiet admiration everyone now felt for her. Miriam stepped off the train, her feet touching the platform with a lightness that came from knowing her journey had reached a place of peace. She took a deep breath, her heart full of the satisfaction that only a life well lived could bring. As she walked down the platform, she looked back one last time, her gaze lingering on the train that had carried her story forward, through each passenger and every shared moment. Around her, the station was quiet, almost serene. The stars shone brightly above, and the soft glow of the station lights cast a warm halo around her. Miriam knew that she had left a part of herself with the people she'd met that day, and they, too, had left something with her. A reminder that every life, no matter how unassuming, holds infinite value. As she continued down the platform, a calm contentment settled within her. Her mother's words echoed softly in her heart. "Leave the world better than you found it, even if only in small ways." Miriam knew she had done that, in ways both seen and unseen. Her story would live on in those who had taken a moment to truly listen, woven into the fabric of their lives, like a quiet, enduring thread. And as the station lights dimmed behind her, Miriam disappeared into the night, her legacy leaving a trail of inspiration, a journey completed yet infinite in its reach, carried forward in the lives of those who had crossed her path, forever changed.